In 1972, Britain celebrated a young hero who sprinted his way into Olympic history. His name was David Jenkins, the man hailed as the Flying Scot. At only 20 years old, he stood among the fastest athletes in the world, carrying the hopes of a nation on his shoulders. But the same drive that made him a champion would one day lead him into darkness. 16 years later, the headlines changed. The same athlete once draped in the Union Jack was now being led away in handcuffs, accused of running one of the largest steroid smuggling operations in America. From Olympic tracks to federal courts, his story became a cautionary tale about the price of ambition and the corruption hidden beneath fame. This is not just the story of an athlete who fell from grace, it is the story of how brilliance, pride, and pressure can turn triumph into tragedy, and how redemption sometimes begins in the ruins. David Andrew Jenkins was born on May 25, 1952, in Pointe-à-Pierre, Trinidad and Tobago. His father worked as a manager at an oil refinery, an ordinary man raising a son who would one day become extraordinary. When the family later moved to Scotland, David's world began to take shape in the classrooms and athletic fields of Edinburgh Academy. From a young age, he stood out for his discipline and quiet determination. Teachers saw a boy who didn't just run fast, he thought fast too. At school, Jenkins's love for sprinting grew naturally. He wasn't the loudest or most confident student, but when he ran, everything changed. His focus, precision, and raw energy made him different from the rest. It was here that coaches first noticed his potential, describing him as a natural athlete with a mind built for winning. Outside the track, David pursued his education with equal seriousness. He studied chemical engineering at the University of Edinburgh, a demanding field that reflected his logical and structured way of thinking. Later, he completed postgraduate studies in management at Heriot-Watt University. By his early 20s, Jenkins had achieved what few could. He was a scholar in science and a rising star in sport. But behind this balance of intellect and athleticism was an unspoken truth. David Jenkins was driven by more than talent. He was obsessed with being the best. That hunger would define his victories, but it would also become the seed of his downfall. For now, though, the world only saw a young man on the edge of greatness, intelligent, disciplined, and unstoppable. By the late 1960s, David Jenkins was no longer just another talented sprinter. He was already breaking junior records and setting times that hinted at something extraordinary. At only 17, he was leading Great Britain's athletics team, a teenager competing against seasoned professionals. Under coach Jack Young's sharp eye, David refined his speed, discipline, and mental strength, qualities that would soon make him a national symbol of excellence. In 1971, at just 19, Jenkins stunned Europe. At the European Athletics Championships in Helsinki, he lined up against older, more experienced athletes. The crowd expected a routine race. What they witnessed instead was history. Running from the outer lane, a position no one favored, Jenkins exploded off the blocks. His stride was smooth, yet ferocious, his control absolute. As the finish line approached, Italy's Marcello Fiasconaro closed in, but Jenkins held firm. In seconds, he became the youngest British male to ever win a European gold medal. That victory made him a national hero. Newspapers called him the Flying Scot, and Britain embraced him as the face of a new athletic generation. His confidence soared, and so did his ambition. A year later came Munich, his first Olympic Games. Jenkins powered through the heats, facing the world's fastest men. In the 400-meter relay, Great Britain fought relentlessly, and when the final baton exchange came, Jenkins sprinted with everything he had. The team finished second, earning Olympic silver. For most athletes, that would be the pinnacle. For Jenkins, it was just the beginning. From 1970 to 1973, and again in 1980, Jenkins trained under Scotland's national coach, John Anderson, a man known for his intensity and precision. Under Anderson's guidance, Jenkins evolved from a gifted runner into a world-class athlete. He dominated national competitions, capturing multiple titles in the 100, 200 and 400 meters. In 1975, his dominance reached across the Atlantic. Competing in the United States, Jenkins became the first Briton to break the 45-second barrier in the 400 meters, a milestone that cemented his name among the world's best. That same year, he won the US National Championship, a rare British triumph on American soil. But even as his fame peaked, something unseen was beginning to form beneath the surface. A quiet pressure, an inner obsession with staying at the top. Success had brought him glory, but it also planted a seed of fear, the fear of slowing down. It was this fear that would later drive him toward the choices that changed his life forever. By the mid-1970s, David Jenkins was living the dream most athletes could only imagine. Fame, sponsorships, and the status of being Britain's golden boy of athletics had made him a household name. But behind the medals and applause, there was something heavier, an invisible pressure that grew with every race. Every headline calling him invincible became another weight on his shoulders. The public saw a champion. Jenkins felt a man trapped in expectation. He trained harder than ever, but the strain was no longer just physical. It was psychological, a war between ambition and exhaustion. Britain expected him to keep breaking records, to remain flawless, untouchable. And in that constant demand for perfection, doubt began to creep in. What if his best wasn't enough anymore? What if the next race exposed his limits? In interviews years later, Jenkins would look back on this period with painful honesty. He described it in one haunting line. It was the beginning of selling my soul, really. That confession revealed what the medals never could, the moral conflict hidden beneath his success. During this time, elite sport was quietly shifting. Steroid use wasn't openly discussed, but it existed in whispers, locker rooms, and unspoken exchanges between athletes desperate to stay competitive. Jenkins didn't start with criminal intent. He started as a man trying to meet impossible standards. The first time he used performance-enhancing drugs wasn't about cheating. It was about survival in a system that demanded more than the human body could give, but with every gain came guilt. He knew what he was risking, his reputation, his integrity, and the trust of those who believed in him. Yet, the line between right and wrong blurred under pressure. Success had defined his identity for too long to let go. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd stop once he regained his edge. But that moment never came. As the late 1970s unfolded, Jenkins was no longer running purely for glory. He was running from fear, fear of decline, fear of irrelevance, fear of being forgotten. The very ambition that once drove him to greatness was now consuming him from within. In the world's eyes, he was still a champion. Inside, he knew something had changed forever. The pursuit of perfection had taken its toll, and the first step into darkness had already been made. By the early 1980s, David Jenkins was no longer defined by stadium lights or national pride. His athletic career had faded, but his ambition hadn't. What began as a desire to stay relevant slowly evolved into something far darker. The man who once sprinted for gold now raced against the law. In the shadows of success, Jenkins crossed paths with Javier Maclis, a figure who would become his partner in one of the largest illegal steroid enterprises the United States had ever seen. Together, they built a transnational operation that moved performance-enhancing drugs across borders like a silent empire. This wasn't a small-time hustle. It was organized, calculated, and lucrative beyond measure. From their base in Mexico, the network stretched across to American distributors, reaching gyms, training facilities, and private buyers nationwide. The scale was staggering. An estimated $100 million worth of anabolic steroids flooded the US market, supplying nearly 70% of its underground demand. Warehouses were filled with vials and cartons, coded shipments disguised as legitimate pharmaceutical goods. Every delivery carried both profit and risk. But this wasn't just about money. For Jenkins, it was a twisted continuation of his old world, a mirror of the same obsession that once drove him on the track. He had traded one kind of performance enhancement for another. The difference now was that the finish line could end in prison. Behind the operation, betrayal became a recurring theme. Jenkins had betrayed the sport that made him a hero, betrayed teammates who still believed in fair competition, and ultimately betrayed himself. The man who once represented athletic integrity had become the face of its corruption. Federal investigators eventually caught on. For months, US authorities traced financial trails, intercepted communications, and pieced together a conspiracy involving 33 individuals across multiple states. The evidence was overwhelming: money laundering, smuggling, illegal distribution. Jenkins's name appeared not as a minor associate, but as a key architect of the system. When the arrests began, the empire collapsed quickly. What had taken years to build unraveled in weeks. Agents raided facilities, seized shipments, and dismantled the very network Jenkins had believed was untouchable. In 1987, David Jenkins stood before a US court, a fallen Olympian facing the full weight of federal law. The judgment was unforgiving: 7 years in Boren Federal Prison Camp in California. For a man once celebrated on the world stage, it was the ultimate humiliation. Inside prison walls, the noise of the crowd was replaced by silence. The medals, the fame, the records, all reduced to memories of another life. Jenkins had reached the peak of human performance and then descended into the depths of criminal enterprise. His story had turned from triumph to tragedy, from discipline to deception. The man who once symbolized national pride was now a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily greatness can collapse under the weight of ambition. The descent was complete, but even in ruin, Jenkins wasn't finished yet. Boren Federal Prison Camp was far from the chaos of the Olympic tracks, yet for David Jenkins, it became the arena where he would finally face himself. Gone were the medals, the interviews, and the applause. In their place came the echo of locked doors, the monotony of prison routines, and the heavy silence of regret. For the first time in his life, Jenkins couldn't run from what he had become. His 7-year sentence should have kept him behind bars well into the 1990s, but the story didn't end that way. Behind those walls, Jenkins made a decision that would change his life again, not through speed or strength, but through cooperation. US authorities, determined to dismantle the steroid empire completely, approached Jenkins with a deal. In exchange for information about his former associates, his sentence could be reduced. It was an opportunity for freedom, but one that came with a cost he couldn't ignore. Jenkins agreed. He chose to help the government build its case against others involved in the operation, including men he had once called partners. He revealed details about supply chains, financial movements, and coded shipments that had eluded investigators for years. In the sterile rooms of federal debriefings, Jenkins sat across from agents tracing the same paths that had made him rich and powerful, this time to help bring them down. When asked later about that decision, his words were painfully honest. "I sold him down the river, and that wasn't cool." It was a line that exposed the emotional conflict behind his cooperation. He didn't glorify it or hide from it. There was guilt, but also clarity. Jenkins had come to understand the depth of his own fall, how easily ambition could rot into betrayal. After just 10 months in custody, Jenkins was released. On paper, he was a free man. In reality, freedom felt like another kind of sentence. The world outside had changed, and so had he. There were no sponsorships waiting, no public sympathy, no warm welcome from the nation that once cheered his name. To many, he was no longer the Olympic runner from Edinburgh. He was the disgraced athlete who had built an empire of steroids and escaped full punishment through cooperation. Those post-prison years were marked by reflection more than ambition. Jenkins wasn't the same man who once chased records with fire in his eyes. Prison had stripped him of illusions. He began to see how his pursuit of greatness had twisted into greed and how his intelligence, once a gift, had become the very tool of his downfall. He admitted that he had spent years justifying his choices, convincing himself that success excused everything. But behind every rationalization was fear. Fear of becoming ordinary, fear of fading into obscurity, fear of losing control. Now, stripped of power and recognition, he finally saw that the things he ran from were the things that could have saved him. His cooperation with authorities brought him early release, but it also branded him. In the athletic world, loyalty was sacred. Betrayal, no matter the reason, was unforgivable. For Jenkins, it meant exile, not just from sport, but from the circle of people who once shared his dreams. He carried that stigma quietly, without self-pity. The same determination that had once pushed him to break records now helped him endure isolation. Those who met him in the years after his release described a man who had changed, still sharp, still composed, but subdued. He no longer spoke about championships or fame. Instead, he talked about consequences, about the thin line between excellence and obsession. He was learning slowly that redemption doesn't come from speeches or apologies. It comes from understanding, from owning what you did without excuses. Looking back, Jenkins seemed to recognize the irony of his life. The discipline that once made him great had also made him dangerous. The same drive that built an athlete had fueled a criminal. But inside prison, stripped of everything, he found what success had never given him: perspective. He would later say that those months behind bars were both punishment and release. Punishment for what he had done, release from who he had become. For the first time, he wasn't chasing anything, not money, not fame, not validation. He was simply learning how to live again. When David Jenkins walked out of Bourne Federal Prison Camp after 10 months, the world barely noticed. The headlines had moved on, but for him, that silence was a kind of mercy. His life had been reduced to its most honest form, a man alone, trying to rebuild what ambition had destroyed. He had fallen from grace, cooperated with the same system that condemned him, and walked out not as a hero or a villain, but as a man finally aware of his limits. His story wasn't about glory anymore. It was about the cost of chasing it too far. When David Jenkins stepped out of prison, his reputation was in ruins. The world that once praised his speed now remembered only his scandal. But behind the silence and shame, a new version of Jenkins began to take shape. One no longer chasing medals or hiding behind crime, but trying to rebuild through knowledge and discipline. He turned back to what he always understood best: science and performance. With a background in engineering and physiology, Jenkins began consulting for fitness and nutrition companies. One of his earliest ventures after prison was with Reebok, where his expertise in sports performance made him valuable again, not as a public face, but as a problem solver working behind the scenes. Slowly, he started reconnecting his intellect with legitimate innovation. Jenkins then created Pro Optibol, a scientifically designed nutritional supplement that reflected his deep understanding of how the human body performed and recovered. What once fueled his obsession with chemical shortcuts was now redirected toward creating safer, performance-enhancing products within the bounds of legality. The irony was sharp. The same man who once trafficked illegal steroids was now working to help athletes train ethically and recover properly. But his real breakthrough came when he founded Next Proteins, a company that would redefine the global protein market. Drawing on his technical insight, Jenkins developed the world's first carbonated protein drink, an innovation that merged sports science with commercial creativity. He secured patents for the product in 41 countries, turning a simple concept into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Next Proteins wasn't just a business, it was Jenkins's way of rewriting his story. The empire he built this time was transparent, legal, and based on invention rather than deception. His company's success showed that his brilliance hadn't died in prison. It had simply been forced to evolve. There was a deep irony in his transformation. The same mind that once engineered secret supply chains and coded transactions was now designing formulas and trademarks. What had once been used to exploit human performance was now being used to enhance it. The same hunger that destroyed his reputation became the fuel for rebuilding it. By the late 1990s, David Jenkins had become something rare, a man who had lived both extremes of success and failure, and somehow found balance between them. He no longer chased fame. Instead, he chased integrity. His reinvention didn't erase his past, but it gave it meaning. In the end, Jenkins proved that even those who fall hardest can find a way to rise again, not by denying what they were, but by transforming what they know. David Jenkins's legacy is a story of duality, a man who lived at the edge of greatness and ruin. For some, he will always be the young Scottish sprinter who stunned Europe at 19, the athlete who carried Britain's hopes and stood on the Olympic podium. For others, his name recalls Betrayal, a fallen hero who turned from the purity of sport to the corruption of smuggling. His life cannot be defined by one without the other, because both were born from the same relentless drive to win. Even today, Jenkins's record-breaking performances remain a part of British athletic history. He was the first Briton to run the 400 metres in under 45 seconds, a milestone that symbolised determination and precision. Yet, behind that achievement lay the same intensity that would one day destroy his career. When victory became an expectation rather than a goal, ambition turned inward, twisting into obsession. The line between pushing limits and crossing them grew thinner until it finally broke. His later years forced him to confront what most athletes never admit, that greatness often demands more than the body or spirit can bear. Jenkins once reflected on his choices with painful honesty, saying, "It was the beginning of selling my soul, really." That confession revealed a man no longer hiding behind medals or fame, but acknowledging the weight of his own decisions. Yet redemption, in its quiet way, did come. After prison, Jenkins did not disappear or make excuses. He rebuilt his life from the ground up, using his scientific mind, not his athletic body. He founded Next Proteins, patented innovations in over 40 countries, and became a millionaire again, but this time through legality and invention. His transformation proved that intelligence and determination could be redirected, that the same traits once used destructively could become tools for progress. Still, his redemption does not erase his past. Jenkins's name remains etched into two very different histories, one of sporting excellence and another of moral collapse. His story challenges how we measure success. Is it the medals we earn or the lessons we learn after losing them? In many ways, Jenkins's life mirrors the darker truth of elite sport, that the pursuit of perfection can become a form of self-destruction. His fall was not just personal, it exposed the silent pressures that drive athletes to extremes. His comeback, meanwhile, symbolized resilience, the ability to rebuild even after public disgrace. David Jenkins's story is neither one of pure villainy nor of unbroken victory. It is a portrait of transformation. A man who fell to his own ambition, faced the full cost of his choices, and emerged, changed, if not absolved. In the end, he leaves behind more than records or controversies. He leaves a reminder that the human spirit, when tested by its own flaws, can still find a way to evolve. Not perfectly, not heroically, but truthfully. Subscribe for more UK true crime documentaries exploring the real stories behind Britain's most complex figures.